we've had a few of you have sent in questions that I'm going to discuss with the bishop, and he and I have talked some things that we're going to discuss together. And so I'm just going to jump in and get started. Now, you have a technical team with you on your side, don't you? Am I remembering correctly?
Well, I do have Norma, my wife, and I have my daughter Sherry.
Great.
I've threatened that I may call on them to answer some of the questions.
Well, I'm here by myself, so if anything goes wrong on my end, I guess I'll just have to count on you to fix that for it. I'll tell you what, questions are already coming in. It's just really interesting. People are already writing in, and questions are already coming in. So I know that we're going to have a great time together today. Why don't we just go ahead and get started, if that's okay?
Sure.
I was thinking back to when you and I first met, and I believe it was Will Cantrell, a pastor in Knoxville, who first connected us. And I don't know if you remember our first conversation, but I did what I often do. I had an idea in the shower, and I wrote to you right away, and it was about a book idea I had. And you said, this is the first conversation we ever, you said, you have to write that book and you have to do it right away. And it was, where do we go from here? And
yes.
It was when what we ended up doing was we came up with 24 names of leaders in the denomination, and you said you would get half of them, and I said I would get the other half. And I'll never forget, because usually it takes a year or so to get a book out. You said we have to have this book out before General Conference, and that was 12 weeks away. And we did. 10 weeks later, the book was on the shelf. It was the best-selling book in the Methodist genre that year.
Is that right? I didn't realize that.
It really was. And so I'll never forget.
We were able to accumulate some good authors, I think.
Oh, it was incredible. And to think that we contacted, got 24 authors to write chapters, edited them, got them back and forth, and got them in a book and on the shelf in 10 weeks was pretty incredible.
That was remarkable.
Pretty incredible.
Quite remarkable.
Hey, you and I have had a lot in common, our growing up years. We grew up in the same place. We went to the same school. I even saw the other day, tell us a little bit about this. You were recognized by one of our former schools, East Tennessee State University, recently.
Well, yes, that was back in December. I was surprised and highly honored to be named as one of the recipients of their 2024 Outstanding Alumni. And they apparently give an award for different areas, and they gave me the award for public service. So it was great to go back to my roots. I lived at home and went to ETSU, but I also went to what was called in those days the training school, with which you're familiar. It was the school. It's still in operation on the campus. And that was those 4 years in high school. Those were very formative years for me. And then I had a scholarship to go on to the university. I lived at home, but being the first generation high school graduate, and also college graduate, of course, those two institutions, the training school, or now what's called university school, and ETSU, were very formative in my own a love for learning, and they opened a whole new vision for the future for me, and I'll forever be grateful to them. And so I was highly honored to be the recipient of that award, and somewhat surprised.
Yeah. Well, after you and I met and after we did that book, we started talking, and you told me several times you wanted to write another book. And after a few years of friendly nudging, what do we call it? That book came out, and it was Shifting Margins.
Yes.
You started out like most Methodist preachers at the time. Let's see, you mentioned college, then seminary, coming from what I describe and you would describe in your book as a humble beginning. How did you pull that off from such a humble beginning? How did you actually end up making it through college and seminary?
Well, that's a good question. I made it through a lot of support from a lot of people and a lot of encouragement. I fortunately came, as I indicated in the book, I came out of poverty, Appalachian poverty. My dad worked at Klopman Mills, a textile mill, and we were also tenant farmers until we were able to purchase a small farm. Hard work was at the center of our lives. We never went on vacations. Work was primary, and so I had built into me a kind of a good work ethic. But I also captured a vision of the future, a future or a world beyond McKinley Road, where I grew up, and that sort of propelled me to move toward that future. And that was partly the result of my experience at the training school or university school. I remember my English teacher, Dr. John Talent, and the assignment to read Great Expectations. And I guess it helped to kindle in me great expectations. But also, it was there that I became a part of the McKinley Methodist Church in those days. And the church was a source of community, a source of belonging, and it also was a place where I was captured by a much broader vision, a transcendent vision of a new world, the reign of God. And therefore, I got a lot of encouragement. I got a lot of support in many ways, scholarships to the seminary, and a lot of support from the Holston Conference, from that local church. So it was from a lot of people that, and also, loving parents, loving community accounts for it, I'm sure. But it really is the grace of God that comes through community.
Well, tell us about your first appointment.
Well, my first appointment was a student. I was a student at ETSU, and I was only 19 years old. I'd gotten a local preacher's license, and Dr. Frank Porter, the district superintendent, called me one day and said, "I'd like to have you serve the Watauga Methodist Church." And that's out in the little community of Watauga on the Watauga River. And it averaged about 20 people in attendance. And I love that. I served there 2 years as a student pastor. And I've often looked back and thought how different my ministry would be had I served a different church, because they felt that one of their reasons for existence was to give young preachers a start, and they knew how to do it. They were they could share their criticism, but it was always supportive, always encouraging. So Watauga was where I served. Now the year that I was nominated, or I was at the annual conference at Junaluska, the year that I was being considered for a bishop, Watauga closed. It was in that list of churches that had outlived its membership, and therefore it was declared abandoned and closed, and it was done rather perfunctory. You've seen those at the annual conference session. The district superintendent reads the names of those churches and they declare them abandoned and closed. And I wanted to get up and say, "Hey, could we stop and celebrate?" That church gave many of us a start. And that did, by the way, when I was a bishop and we got to that part of the conference agenda, I always stopped and said, "Are there any persons here who served that church or who were baptized in that church?" Because churches go through life cycles just as individuals do. And the life cycle of the Watauga Methodist Church went through its life cycle, but its influence continues to live because it shaped me, certainly, and formed me.
That's especially interesting to me because, as you know, you and I had very similar growing up periods in a very similar place. And I used to ride my bicycle past that Watauga Methodist Church quite often, and you might have actually been the pastor there when I was riding my bicycle past there.
I could have been. That was 1960 to 1962.
Okay, so that would have been a little bit ahead of then. Yeah, yeah. I've worked with a lot of bishops, and we have a lot of bishops who write books for us here. These days, when people are up for bishop, they usually have teams of people helping them and all that kind of thing. I've got a feeling it was probably different when you were elected bishop. What was the process like when you were elected bishop?
Well, when I was elected, annual conferences they were engaged in what we call vote swapping. I mean, they would enter into conversations with other conferences and other delegations, uh, saying that we'll support your candidate if you will support our candidate, or that was the process. I did not feel comfortable at all with that process. I did not know that I wanted to be a bishop. I had very mixed feelings about that. But I always felt that it was the church's call, not my call. I had given my commitment to be obedient to the church and to follow its call. And I never tried to select my appointments or where I would serve next, and that included being a bishop. And so I said to the delegation, and at that time the lay delegate, or the two persons, Gene Henderson and Evelyn Laycock, were the two leaders of the delegation, the lay delegates. And I indicated to them and to the delegation that I would not be involved and did not want them to be involved in any kind of agreement with annual conferences, since I was not committed, I had the best appointment possible, and that was as the pastor at Church Street. And I didn't know whether I really wanted to leave that appointment or not. And so when I met with delegations, and we did have the sessions where we would communicate with other delegations and be interviewed and so forth. And as the delegations would often ask me, well, why do you think you ought to be a bishop? And my response was, well, I'm not sure that I should be, but I'm not the one who's making that decision. You're the ones who are making that decision. Since I'm not so totally committed to being a bishop, that's not my life's desire, then you ask me whatever you want to ask, and I'll be honest with you where I stand, and then you make the decision as to whether I should be a bishop or not. And I still don't know whether they made the right decision or not. But once it was made, once it was made, I felt that when they said, "Well, are you convinced that God is calling you to that position?" I said, "Well, God has never mimeographed me, or that was back in the days of mimeographs, any response to my requests, and so I'm not clear that." And the church has made mistakes in the past, but I do feel that once I am elected, it is God's will that I do be the best bishop I can possibly be. So that was my goal.
When we first started talking about this book project, which became Shifting Margins, I didn't realize you had a memoir in mind. And when I read the first draft of the first chapter that you sent to me, I became incredibly excited about the book. What motivated you to write a memoir?
I really didn't set out to write a memoir initially. Just a little background. My granddaughter, Megan, when she was a little tyke, and we would be traveling through and stopping in to visit Sherry and John and Megan, Megan would often crawl up on my lap and say, "Papa, tell me a story." So I began telling stories, most of them out of fiction that I had read or made up. But then I ran out of my creativity. So I started telling her some stories of my own childhood. And every time after that, when she would climb on my lap and say, Papa, tell me a story and I want to hear about your childhood. And then she told me, I want you to write their stories. That's when she became, as she grew up. And so she encouraged me to write stories. I began writing down stories from my own life and experience. And I collected those. And they've suggested that they call them stories from the Paw Paw Patch. And if you read the book, you see that in the introduction to the book. But I've kept a journal most of my years. And so I have lots of stories. So I began to write stories, just incidents without any sense of publication, mostly perhaps to leave for my family. So they would have stories of my own life and experience. And then I began, and Sherry, my daughter Sherry, and Sandra, and others began to suggest that perhaps you might want to write the story of your life. The first draft of the book, as you may recall, had over 600 pages of stories, but I had this rather, what should I say? Well, I had an editor that insisted, and a publisher that insisted that that's far too many pages, and it's probably too boring, that many pages. So the process of cutting it began. But the other thing that motivated me to write a book about that contributed to my motivation was that when I was on the faculty at Duke, I co-taught a class with Dr. Mary McClintock Fulkerson, who is a feminist theologian, a wonderful, wonderful theologian who has done a lot of ethnographies. And our book, or our class, was entitled Prophetic Ministry, Shaping Communities of Justice. And as the course moved along, I learned that my role was to kind of translate the abstract theological concepts of the brilliant Dr. Fulkerson into concrete experiences. And therefore, I would tell stories that grew out of my own ministry, or experiences that grew out of my own ministry and my own life. And Dr. Fulkerson, after that course, she said, Ken, you've got to write an autoethnography. I said, well, you'll first have to tell me what that is. And she said, well, you need to write about the relationship between your social location and your theological and pastoral perspectives and practices. And that put me on the trail, or on the journey of connecting how context affects content, how we're shaped by our socioeconomic context, and therefore that's how I began to realize. And if I'm going too much here, you interrupt me. But I began to realize that my own life journey has parallels to the journey of the church, particularly the United Methodist Church. I journeyed, and that my own journey was a lived experience of many of the struggles that we are experiencing in our culture today. For example, I journeyed from poverty to privilege, with all of the tension involved in that journey, and the relationship between economic disparity and what it does to people's lives. I lived that. I lived the poverty, and I've lived the privilege now, and struggle and continue to struggle with that tension. But I grew up in a racially segregated world. I went to segregated schools. The first African American friend I had was in seminary, and there, as you know, Johnson City has a very small minority of African Americans, or at least when I was growing up, a very small percentage. So we're continuing to struggle with racial and ethnic injustices and disparities and prejudices and racism. Well, I've lived that. It's been internalized in me. I still struggle with my own endemic racism and prejudices. But I also grew up in a very rigid, fundamentalist, fear-based religion for the earlier parts before I started into the Methodist Church, which was when I was about 11, before I became exposed to the Methodist Church. So I've lived that fear-based religion that is also rigid and still based in retributive justice, that God is the judge, the fear of hell, the end of times, the rapture. That's a part of what formed me and shaped me. And we're still struggling with that rigid religion, fear-based approach to life. So much of what we're doing and what's happening in our culture is out of fear politically. Also, the economic disparities I've lived, the rigid religion versus a religion of grace and hospitality, and I've also lived with this whole notion of retribution and punishment versus reconciliation and restoration and grace. It's not just in the criminal justice system, but that's where it's most obvious. So I've lived that when God is the judge and the executioner, or the one who says, if you don't measure up, you're going to be punished, versus a God who is merciful, gracious, accepting of all, including all in the dance of love. And then now I'm living with a new reality, and that's the whole matter of aging, diminishment, approaching frailty. And for 10 years, and they were perhaps the most intensely formative years of my life, was the 10 years that I journeyed with Linda in her dementia, living with in a highly cognitive world, and operating in that world and succeeding in that world. I mean, I was a professor at Duke when Linda was, where we grade people on the basis of their thinking and their communicative abilities. And now I'm living with a person that I love dearly, who is losing her ability to think and to communicate. And what are the implications of that for who God is, where God is, what God is doing, and what God expects of us? So I've lived so much of these margins that have shifted, and the image or the metaphor of shifting margins really I owe to the pastoral theologian John Swinton at St. Andrews, who has written I was introduced to him through his book, Dementia: Living in the Memories of God. And he said he in one of his lectures that I've met him now and have talked with him personally, but in one of his lectures, he says that Jesus did not go to the margins. Jesus shifted the margins to where those on the margins of society were central to the ministry. He expanded the margins and put the vulnerable, the weak, the powerless at the center of life and of his work and of the kingdom of God. And I thought, that's it. That's it. That's my life. My whole life has consisted of shifting margins, margins from poverty to privilege, the margin from segregation to integration and then reconciliation and transformation, margins from fundamentalism or rigid rule-based religion to religion of unlimited grace, boundless grace and inclusion, and the margin from engagement, positions of influence. Now I'm living with the margin of shifting to diminishment and disengaging and moving toward the end of my own life. So the margins are constantly shifting. But it also occurs to me that is the essence of Christian discipleship. It is growth, particularly in the Wesleyan tradition. It's growth in grace. It's the entire love of God shed abroad in our hearts. It's going on to perfection, meaning in Wesleyan terms, perfection in love, the entire love of God shed abroad in our hearts. So we're constantly shifting the margins in our thinking, in our relationships, and in our growth in relationship with God. Because if we think we've got God within our margins right now, we've got the wrong God. God is beyond my ability to comprehend or experience. And therefore, discipleship, relationship with God is a lifelong shifting of the margins. And God is always justifying the margins through grace. That's what justification means. I don't see justification now primarily through the lens of the courts or legalities. You know, that God has declared me innocent before a court. I see shifting margins now. I see justification now the way I use my word processor that has a means by which I can justify the margins. And what I understand is God is ever expanding those margins through grace.
Well,
that's a long answer to a short question.
Well, that's fine. Well, I'm going to continue on it with that question. What difference did you hope this book would make when you wrote it, or after you wrote it?
I was hoping that my story would resonate with or would help to motivate other persons to look at their own stories, and because we are all called to be extensions of the incarnation. And it's through our stories that we bear witness in the world. And that if my story and my journey and my dealing with these margins of economic disparities, of race and racism, of a punitive and fear-based approach to life, if my approach could be helpful to others, then perhaps that's what I would hope it might And I hope that I have gained some insight into how we might shift the margins of the church, because I'm convinced that the future of the church lies partly in our recovering our presence among those who are on the margins. And that means doing what Swinton indicates that Jesus did, that we've got to shift the margins so where all are included: the frail, the elderly, those suffering with dementia, those who are in our prisons, those who are the victims of racism, as we all are, and those who are the victims of economic inequalities. I think I've learned some things from my own experience in working in churches. And my first role in the church was I became the janitor at McKinley Church. And so my first paid job in the church was I was a janitor. My last paid job in the church, I was a bishop. And I'll let you be the judge as to whether I went up or down. But I think I think my story, I've learned something from the people, the congregations I've served. It was in the church that as I served in seminary, that I learned the importance of overcoming racism by relationships, and we were able to. I served two churches they were located within 2 miles of one another. One of them was the old ME Church, and the other was the old ME Church South, and located between the two of them was the Pleasant View Church, and that was part of the central jurisdiction. Well, I through that ministry, we merged the two that I served, and then we paved the way for the incorporation of the third church. So there currently is a church in Montgomery County, Maryland, that is now fully integrated, fully inclusive, that are the result of those three churches. But it began with my friendship with the pastor of that church, Tom Barrington, and our first experience was we invited the kids from the young boys from the Pleasant View Church to be part of the Scouts, and then the UMW started meeting together. So I've learned some things over the years, and the dialogues in Oak Ridge. We had a similar experience in Oak Ridge, a relationship between Oak Valley Baptist Church and First Church. So I just use that as an example. I think my own struggle has helped me and my own experience in shifting these margins or struggling with these margins may have something to contribute to where we are in the church today. That chapter I wrote in that book on the way forward is on what's the next thing. We need to go to the margins and recover our presence there. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, I want to discuss that a little bit more, but before I do, let me remind folks who are with us that questions are coming in, and later on we'll take some time and I'm going to read some of these questions to you and let you respond to those. So feel free to use that questions area. You probably see it on the side of your screen, and we'll discuss a few of those in just a little bit. You said that you struggled with the title, and you talked about some of the margins in the churches today. You've had a lot of experience in the church. You've been everything from a janitor to a bishop. What do you see as the critical challenges facing the church today, especially in our United Methodist Church?
There are several. One is the challenge is moving from a privileged institution in American society to be marginalized in American society. You see, when I began ministry in the church, on the cusp of the growth in the 1950s and 60s.
Mhm.
Well, the dramatic decline of the institutional church, and it's not just United Methodist, but mainline churches. But we've declined significantly in the last, in my lifetime. We were just like my own journey with privilege. The Methodist Church was privileged in the 50s and 60s in our culture. To be an American meant you went to church. About 49% in the 50s, about 49% of the people in this country would attend a church. Now it's down to about 24%. That's happened in my lifetime. We're losing our own children and our own grandchildren. And now with our disaffiliations and divisions within the United Methodist Church, we've become weaker as institutions. We become smaller. So one of the challenges, how do we confront the loss of our privilege in society and our, quote, relevance in this society? We no longer look to the church for meaning, and I think even COVID, many people found they could actually get along pretty well without going to church. So they haven't come back, and many will not come back. I think the day of the increased growth, how are we going to deal with that? I would suggest that may be an advantage to us, that we need to come to grips with what it means to be on the margins ourselves as a society. So facing that particular challenge, I think is the immediate one. The day of the privileged institution in society is gone for the institutional church. I think we also need to move from the preferential presence with the privileged to presence with those on the margins. Now, many of those are in our congregations now. They are the ones who are in our nursing homes, or the frail, or they may be the youth in our church. But those we've often had our preferential presence among the privileged. Even in, I was a part of I chaired the in Holston Conference Church Extension Committee back in the 1980s, and we had this notion of we go where the people are. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that meant we go where certain people are. It meant we followed the population to the suburbs. So we abandoned the poor. We went where, and I was a beneficiary of that. Concord is a wonderful church, and very faithful, and Middlebrook Pike and Cokesbury. Those are wonderful churches, but they are also pretty homogeneous, racially, socioeconomically. And so often we build our churches among the people who are privileged. We move to the suburbs and abandon the cities. I think we've got to return to our roots among the poor, economically poor, and those others who are on the margins of our society. And that's a challenge. We don't know how to do that because we've operated so long from a middle class, a white, professional middle class cultural context that we don't know quite how to deal with and even communicate well with people who live in adverse poverty, who live in our jails, who are now inhabiting our nursing homes. When Linda was in the memory unit at the retirement community, I saw that as a microcosm of where we are as a church. These people are forgotten, and yet being present with them, some of the most vibrant experiences of worship, of the presence of God, I experienced in my role as the chaplain of that unit. So I'm suggesting one challenge is let's acknowledge our position of marginalization, get in touch with our identity, because now participating in the church is being done by those who want to participate, not those who are who feel like this as it's just part of the expectation of being a good citizen. Now, it's not going to be so popular to be a part of the church, particularly a church that is totally inclusive of all people, a church that demands justice and speaks truth to power. It's not going to be popular to be a part of churches like that, but I think that's what it means to be the church. I think another challenge is to move, that's immediately before us, is to move from how do I phrase it? Kind of a thought theology to a lived theology. We have so long focused on if we can just believe properly. And I've written books on United Methodist beliefs, and I value that. But what I learned in my relationship with Linda and my work among and relationships with people in memory units who live with dementia, we can't, God isn't limited to my thoughts about God. Having correct beliefs is not the essence of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. It is living the reality behind our doctrines. We've got to recover what's in our discipline now, and that's both doctrinal standards and our theological task. We have focused so much on doctrinal standards as deciding who's in and who's out, who's orthodox and who isn't, who's conservative and who's not. We've got to move beyond that to exploring the implication and forming people in accordance with those doctrines. It's one thing to believe that all people are created in the image of God. It's another thing to experientially relate to one another as persons made in the image of God. And we have taught to that doctrine, but our congregations, and I bear some responsibility for this, our congregations aren't shaped to relate to one another as people with inherent worth and dignity. We say if we can just get our beliefs, our thinking right, we will behave properly. That's not, we've proven that isn't accurate. We have to shape people experientially. And that means we need congregations that are not homogeneous, where we live with one another in all of our differences and struggle. That's one reason I think the whole concept of disaffiliation and division is contrary to the very purpose that we exist We're saying we can't live together, worship together, and serve together because we disagree on something we believe. That's absurd, in my opinion. That's elevating doctrinal formulations to the level of an idol. We're to participate. The essence of Christian discipleship and the essence of what the church exists to help us do is to learn to participate in the triune God's dance of love. And that means we have to shape congregations that know how to love one another, how to care for one another, whatever our cognitive beliefs. And I would add, in terms of my experience with Linda, I learned that receiving love is no less a participation in the flow of love than giving it. And there are those who seem to be incapable of receiving our love, or at least responding to or reciprocating in the way we expect them to or desire them to do. That doesn't excuse us to not love them any longer. When Linda could not reciprocate love, it was my responsibility, my privilege, I would add, to give her love and care. And in so doing, she was increasing my capacity to love without reciprocity. The church has to shape people that way, and people on the margins, the powerless, the frail, those outside our churches now can teach us how to do that. But we've got to enter their world and be present with them and receive their gifts in order to do that. I went
Bishop,
to preaching more than I answered your question. But
well, I'm going to have you stop preaching for just a minute, because if it's okay with you, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are coming in.
oh, sure.
I'll just pick one here. This is from Kim. Kim asked, you said you still struggle with racism. I've sought throughout my ministry to reach out and to have relationships and be friends with those marginalized groups. Since I'm female, I have often felt marginalized, often though it feels like folks resent those who seek to shoulder to shoulder. I'm not sure how, even with our best efforts, we can overcome other people's perception of racism. How do we judge when we have gotten beyond our racism? If you can't do it, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Oh, that's a very, very good question and a very good point. I reckon I have that same struggle. I live in a homogeneous world, and I have to make a special effort to go into the world of the other. But I think we need to just keep trying. And who are the people that are within our sphere of possibilities of relationships? For example, in my care in Linda's journey, we had caregivers who were all African American, and I struggled because I got to the point where I was able to share my struggle with them, that here I am, a white guy, having you do menial servant tasks, and I don't want to treat you that way, but I don't know how to overcome that. And now that took a while for us to relating, but they helped me I think one thing we need to give people permission, permission to respond to our expressions of racism. I know for me, when I went to Mississippi, I said during the worship service where I was my consecration for those years that I was going to be there, I acknowledged that I said I come out of East Tennessee. I shared with them that my first friend was that I had as an African American was in seminary as an adult, and that I therefore have within me the residues of racism and prejudice, but I don't want to be racist. I want to give you permission to share with me if you detect racism in me, that you would come to me and share that with me. I report this in the book, one of the district superintendents who is Black came to me afterward and said, "Bishop, do you really mean what you say about wanting us to share with you?" And I said, "Yes, I do. Although what I shared in that sermon was, I prefer you come to me personally and we can discuss this on a personal basis. But if you have to embarrass me, then go ahead and do it. Because I consider racism to be a diabolical sin, and I'd rather lose face than to lose my soul." So when Ludrick, the district superintendent, and I share this with his permission, by the way, Ludrick said, "I appreciate that, and I will do it, but I'm not sure we can trust it." And he went on to say, and this is where he helped me shift my margin. He said, "But Bishop, don't make us responsible for curing you of your racism. That's your responsibility." I needed to hear that. I think we just need to be as available and as open as we can. And just simple expressions of concern. Tex Sample, my good friend Tex, said he remembered the first time that he said to someone who had, I think it was a clerk in a store or somebody who had waited on him, he said, I just said, "Well, thank you, sir." And the man said, "What did you say?" He said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "You called me sir. I don't get called sir much. That's what I'm supposed to call you." I think just these incidental relationships might lead to others, but I think I have to constantly work at it, and I'm still working at it. And that's one of the tragedies of our homogeneous, segregated communities and neighborhoods. We don't have the opportunity to interact, but find deliberate ways of doing that. And if it's just one person, I don't know how helpful that is, but I still struggle with it. It's one of those margins we need to work on.
If you saw me grin when you mentioned Tex Sample, I got a message from him a few days ago, and it started with, "I don't know if you know who I am." And I wrote him back.
He just celebrated his 90th birthday.
Yeah, that's right. That's what he mentioned. But I said, "Of course I know who you are." It was kind of funny. Of course I knew who Tex Sample was. And I told him I was jealous of his name. I told him he had the perfect author's name. I grew up with Kevin Slimp. Tex Sample. How can you go wrong as an author with a name like text
Well,
sample.
one of the most important things I did in Mississippi was I brought Tex Sample and Will Campbell to spend 2 days with our cabinet and just sharing their experiences with racism and
Wow.
growing up in Mississippi.
We've got a lot more questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but we are going to look at a couple more. I was
I'll
going
try
to
to be more brief.
No, that's fine. I was just going to mention that you and I had talked about doing this again if there seemed to be an interest. And from the questions that are coming in, there's definitely an interest. So I think we'll schedule.
I would love to do this on a regular basis if that would be possible.
So if we don't get to your
have
question,
more conversation.
sure. So if we don't get to your questions today, don't worry. We're going to come back and do this again, and I'll save all these questions. One more that I wanted to get to, because Alan was one of the first ones to write in. It's a little different from the other questions that have come in, but I think it's a good one and an honest question. Alan asked this, as a theologically moderate pastor, how do I know that there'll always be a place for me in my voice in the denomination, with the more progressive views? And he mentions some things like that. But as a theologically moderate pastor, do you think he'll always have a voice in the denomination?
Yes. In fact, I think we must have his voice. I would consider myself, I don't like the labels.
Mhm.
I don't know what it means to be moderate versus progressive and conservative. I'm conservative on many things.
Mhm.
I'm progressive on some. I mean, that is, I'm open. I think we've got to be both conservative and progressive. We've got to have these bedrock. That's where doctrinal standards and theological exploration. We've got to have our firm convictions while being open and humble in recognizing that the application and the formation of those convictions have always got to be open to growth and revision. We live in a world that's rapidly changing. We need anchors and we need exploration. So I think moderates are in that role of helping to. We all need to be moderating between the conservative, the doctrine, the tradition, and the innovation that needs to take place. We've got to moderate that. That's where I think the image of shifting margins. So
I want to
definitely.
Yeah. Well, as we conclude our time today, there's one thing I wanted to ask you, and take a few minutes on this, and feel free you don't have to answer quickly. In the book, you talk about your struggles, and I think this will sound familiar probably to a lot of us, but you talk about your struggles with the imposter syndrome, what you call the imposter syndrome. Do you briefly tell us what that is, and do you still feel like you struggle with that?
Oh, yes. I think I've always struggled with it. And that is that I am not as competent or as good as I am not. We are not what our public image is. That I still struggle with feelings of inferiority and inadequacy. I still ruminate more than I should about regrets, from the past. But I have made peace with that. In that, I am loved and valued for just who I am. And I hold on to that even when I don't feel it. And the other thing that I've concluded is, if I'm totally satisfied, if I feel that there are no inadequacies, or how should I state it? If I feel totally content with where I am in my growth toward love for God and neighbor, then I don't have I don't have an adequate vision. If I'm fully living the vision, my vision is too small. We've got to have so that going on to perfection, I'm far from it. But if I lose the vision and am totally satisfied, and it doesn't matter what people think, then perhaps I've settled for less than what God intends for us. But I do hold on to the affirmation that I am accepted just as I am by God. But I have to remind myself of that. And we need community that helps us, and relationships. I'm surrounded by family members who know my foibles and still love me. And that's only a hint of how God relates to me. So I hold on to that.
That's an amazing thing. Well, I want to be respectful of people's time, and I know you do too. So we're a little bit past the 1 hour mark. We have a long list of questions here and comments. So I would suggest we get back together soon and do this again.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that. And I'd love to hear from folks in whatever way they could communicate with me.
We'll make sure and contact everyone that was here today, registered to be here today. There were almost 200 of them, Bishop. So people were interested in hearing what you had to say.
Oh my gosh.
Tony Capolo used to say when people ask him how many were in Wednesday night Bible study, he would always say between 200 and 300, because 12 was between 200 and 300. So when I said almost 200, you actually had almost 200. Hey, thank you, Bishop. Do you have any final comments you'd like to leave?
No, just thank you, and thanks for your interest. And I would like to have the opportunity for continuing conversation, because I can learn so much from the people. I'd like to hear more input from those who have raised the questions.
Well, pay attention to your emails. We'll make sure and let you know when we're going to do this again, Bishop. Thank you so much. It's always so good to be with you. My name's Kevin Slimp. Most of you know me. We've gotten to know each other. I'm publisher at Market Square Books. And everyone, thanks for joining us today. We will catch you next time. And Bishop, one last time, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
Everybody have a great
rest of the day. Thank all of you who listen.